And so we're moving directly on to our second session this afternoon, which, as I alluded to just before, at the end of that last session, is looking at education. So it's a shame that we didn't quite get the chance to tie in those previous questions, but I'm looking forward to some active conversations during the break, and perhaps some of them will come up in our session after the break, which will be on governance as well. I think that all of us in this room would agree that education is an absolutely key contributor to sustainable growth and productivity and well-being, and I'm sure that we all agree that. But it's a big cost to government as well, and it's difficult to get right, including for the diverse and perhaps even evolving student population that it's serving. So what we're doing in this session is we're turning to put schools under the microscope, with a particular focus on how we turn around any things that need turning around in those schools. Our panellists for this session, we're great. It's great that we've got a wealth of experience here. We've got our first speaker will be Frances Valintine. Frances is the founder and CEO of AcademyEX, the Mind Lab and Tech Futures Lab you might also have heard of. Our second speaker will be Alwyn Poole. Alwyn is the co-founder and the lead of Innovative Education Consultants. And our third speaker is Susan Hassall. Susan is the headmaster of Hamilton Boys High School, so she'll be known to a number of us in the audience. Those of you that have got sons that have been to Hamilton Boys High School will be familiar with Susan and the work that she's done for an extended period of time at Hamilton Boys High School. So I'd like to pass straight to you, please. Wonderful. Frances.
Wonderful to be here today and talking about the subject that's so close to my heart. You can't hear? Okay, I've got it. Hopefully you can hear me. Good, thank you, Paul. Look, I just want to start by picking up on the last conversation around demographics. My role is to look at the future needs of the workforce, and so that's very much my focus of my research and my activity, and also at my graduate schools. And when we think about demographics in education, we cannot go away from that. Right now, we have a significant shift in the way we are thinking about training. We have to think about the types of jobs and how often people will need to go back into the workforce, back into training. But also, if we start thinking about the ageing population and where we are having growth in fertility, which is in our Māori, Pacific, and our immigrant communities. And so, just as an example, I'll start with Te Tau Tokoro. So the Northland of New Zealand is a great example of what happens. It's our fastest growing region in the country. It has predominantly been populated by retired Pākehā, and we have a very large youth-based Māori population. So the work that I've been doing up there is really starting to focus on what are the challenges there in achievement? How is the success looking in terms of relevancy, context, and actually what happens if you get it wrong? And so if we start looking at a region that is advanced on the rest of the country, both in terms of where we're going to be, in terms of our population being older and white, and then we start looking at the challenges of climate change, it's already been impacted significantly in the region, and then the number of people leaving the region, not to disperse across Aotearoa, but to leave to Australia. So the skill sets that we need to be equal across all our demographic groups. Right now, in 2023, we have 283,000 people over the age of 65 working, versus 85,000 in 2010. We're going to live longer, so we need to train multiple times. And so we have to think about education not in this sort of preloading just in the school system, but actually how do we get smart people making strategic decisions throughout our entire country. So we do need to make sure we have people studying, going into university and being highly skilled. So when I think of education and having taught multiple people in both in the compulsory sector on the outside of the formal sector and also now in the postgraduate space, what I note more than anything is the low participation we have in education. So I'll start by talking about the number of people in our country who go into postgraduate study at master's level is just 5%, which is one of the lowest in the developed world. We rely heavily on immigrants for our top jobs. We often talk about immigrants coming in to take on some of our low-skilled jobs, but you only need to look at the demographics and the statistics around the types of roles they take on, which are often at the top end of town. They're making the most strategic decisions on behalf of our country. So for me, when we go backwards to the source of where this comes from, first of all, as a small advanced economy, we have the biggest employer is the government. The second biggest employer is a sole trader. So we don't have the international investment that other nations have. You know, we run small businesses for a small economy. The competitive nature of education is not part of our DNA. We rely on international talent and capability in many parts of our labour workforce. And then we have to talk about why do we not value education? It goes all the way back into our schools. And our schools right now are seeing some challenges around record absenteeism, context and relevance challenges, and we're starting to see that in a way that we can only take and extrapolate from that if we don't do something significant, that actually more and more people will opt out of participating fully in education, and then all of the compounded effects that we're already experiencing through demographic change will become even greater. I'll start by using an example of a library. If you think about a library as a place that we all spent time growing up, as a source, and in many cases the only source of factual information, we've seen how much they have had to pivot and recreate, reimagine what a library is today. And now they're often places where there is community participation, there are often technology that you can access, there's ways of collaborating. I went today and looked at the number of roles for a librarian in New Zealand right now. 7. And one of those is for a toy library. I looked at data management, which is fundamentally what we're talking about with libraries, and we have over 600 jobs. And so libraries have moved on a long way, and they're looking at context and relevance all the time, and yet for some reason in education we hold on as though we have the problem with the school, and instead of saying schools under the microscope, I'd like to put out there students under the microscope. Because if we took a user-centric, customer-focused design for the education system, we'd look at young people today and say, what would make school relevant to them, still keeping the focus on quality of literacy, numeracy, digital fluency, but making sure they understand where it's taking them. In a world that today, more than ever, we understand the impact of technologies such as artificial intelligence and automation. And so if we don't take a student-centric design, we will continue to argue the relevance of schools. And schools are merely, in my world, buildings that house people to do amazing things. So I'll pass over to Alwyn, and just to leave it on that note, but I really want to think about what does a student today need so that when they hit 30, 50, 80, and then 100, that they continue to learn, and education continues to be relevant, fit for purpose for the time that they live.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is this working? I'm one of those lucky people that consider that I've never worked a day in my life because I fell into teaching and have loved every moment of it. The importance of it, I think, is graphically illustrated even in my family. My mother was born in 1934 into a home with 11 siblings in a state house in Aramaho, Wanganui. I never met my birth father, but my father-in-law, who passed away a few years ago, he spent 6 years of his young life in Holland under Nazi oppression. When we think about children standing on the shoulders of their parents, those two, if they were still alive, could look now and see 3 of their grandchildren through my family. One is a fabulous chemical engineer at Regeneron in Albany, New York State. One is a degree qualified firefighter, although I might say if you own a home in Remuera, I'd think about shifting. And one, a daughter who is about to complete her PhD. And I was going to ask Matt, really, about an honorary PhD for myself. I had a conversation with Ben Stokes on Monday night, and on the basis of that made some investments on Tuesday morning, and I've got enough money to make a fair donation to the management school. A couple of anecdotes in terms of teaching and what makes it interesting and keeps me in it. One day I had Rodney Hyde in my office as the Minister or Assistant Minister of Education, and of course children didn't think of him as a politician, they thought of him as a dancer. And so while we're sitting in the office, a young man called Alex, who now works for an organisation called Will and Able, heavily autistic, and he's out sweeping the path, and he looks through the window and he sees Rodney, and he puts down the broom, and I say to Rodney, I'm not responsible for what this boy says. And so I see Alex stump around, come through the front door, across the foyer, looks Rodney up and down and says, "You're Rodney Hyde." And Rodney graciously acknowledged that fact, and Alex says, "You're a lot fatter than you look on TV," and turned around and walked out. I had to apologise, but Rodney was a good sport. I've taught a lot of quirky kids, and I love them, and they have to find their place in our New Zealand education system. Remember, another little boy called Harry was sitting at one of the front desks, and I looked over and he's eating a glue stick. And I said, "Harry, don't eat the glue stick, you'll make yourself sick." And he says, "Mr. Poole, it says here non-toxic." And I said, "Well, okay, but if you eat too much of it, it'll go right through your digestive system and stick your butt cheeks together." And he says, "No, when I sit down, I just pull those butt cheeks apart and I'm fine." And these kids are everywhere in our system. But in fact, of the 815,000 kids in our system, they're all different and they needed to be treated differently. I had the privilege of teaching my own children. I think one of the huge solutions in our system is that teachers teach as if every child is theirs and bring the same standards to the table. There is no doubt that our education system is in trouble. There are two reports that I released earlier this week and are on your tables. And they add to the body of evidence. Successive governments, our Ministry of Education, and other interventions are utterly failing. You can look at this from the perspective of ethnicity or socioeconomics or the growing divergence between the achievement of girls as opposed to boys. But in each case, we need to understand that the whole of society suffers. We've often looked at education from the point that, well, my kids are all right, 75% of kids are all right. It's less than that now. But in fact, the impact on those children is massive. A lot of them will never rent a good home. They will never save to buy. They'll never take an OE. They won't grow up to support their own family. It is a massive societal problem. There are great schools, so in one of the reports I've highlighted some of them. O for awesome, orange. And just one example, St. Paul's in Ponsonby. 4 years ago, their university entrance for leavers was 54%. They're a school that is 95% Māori and Pacifica, and through the leadership of Karen Fui, in 4 years they took their UE to leavers for right up to 84%, an exceptional effort. To me, though, the glaring solution is parenting. That is not to blame parents for every issue, but that's to say that we now know, through neuroscience and all sorts of advances, exactly what should happen during the time a child develops within the womb, exactly what should happen in the first 0 to 3, then 3 to 5 years, but we don't apply it, and many of our families don't know it. So the heaviest thing that I'm advocating for, and hearing good responses on, is that we need a Crown entity for parenting, not one that tells people what to do and enforces it, but one that spreads the information about what good parenting practices are. I have never met a parent in my 30 years of education that doesn't love their child and want good things for their child. But I've met thousands who don't know how, and it's no longer an excuse. Thank you.
Thanks, Alwyn. Susan?
Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai, whakatau mai. Yes, I am Susan Hassall, and thank you very, very much for having me this afternoon. Alwyn made the typical teacher's mistake of handing out the reading material while he spoke, so I can ask you now as a typical teacher to put your reading material down and listen very carefully to me for the next 2.5 minutes that Alwyn has left me to speak in my allotted 5 minutes. So thank you very much, Alwyn. I will speak quickly because I come to this perspective this afternoon as a practitioner, as a person who has invested 40 years in a school. I've been headmaster for 23 years, so I've seen iterations of the educational journey where many initiatives have occurred, and I've lived through them, seen the impact of them on our young men. So it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with two people who have looked at it through a different lens or a different microscope, if you like, but do have a lot of wisdom in what they're offering. But I'm coming to it from a pragmatic perspective of what matters most to our young people in education at the moment. And I acknowledge there is a genuine problem in our education system. It's not the problem that you might see reflected in that data, because my first point really is that data is easily manipulated and it doesn't necessarily show the reality. But there is a genuine problem that both of the people up here with me this afternoon have highlighted, and those problems have been exacerbated by COVID, but really just highlighted by COVID. They've been growing problems in our secondary school sector for some time, and as a person who loves these boys, and they are boys in my case, you see the impact of it, and it really is a point that New Zealand has reached in terms of its economic future from your perspective, but in terms of our social future, that we have to stop and look and see what else we can do, what we can do better and what we can do differently. But when I say that, I also believe very, very strongly that things aren't broken, that there is so much good in our education system. There are so many schools doing a wonderful job. You'll see some of those in the data, but you'll also see schools out there who are just doing things well for our young men and young women. And what I do want, the point I do want to make to you today as a practitioner of 40 years is that young people are absolutely wonderful. They're on our side. They want to be with us as we make those differences to their lives. It's not a problem that we need to start from scratch. It's a problem that we need to do like the repair shop does and take a very tatty old chair and turn it into something wonderful. We can do that with our education system as long as we all work together. And the need is in the state system of education in New Zealand. And the problem is in where the money is put. And where the money is put in education, this is my first tangent, but my only one, is into ministry officials. And where the money isn't put is into the schools. And that's my little moment of having a political moment here, in case there's anybody here who can make a difference. But the real question is, how can we turn it around? How can we turn it around? And it comes back, I think, to the question, and it is almost rhetorical, of what is the key purpose of education in a New Zealand secondary school in the 21st century post-COVID? What's our key purpose? And there's a pendulum in education. It swings from one side to the other. And at one side it's to prepare people for the workforce. And I'm sure many of you will think that that's the right side that it should be on. And at the other end of the pendulum, it's to prepare young people to become good citizens. And at Hamilton Boys High School, we're on that end of the pendulum. We really are. And there are many schools like Hamilton Boys High School. I'm not going to brag about our school, but the young men that we graduate are not young men who we're proud of as young men of 18, but that we're proud of the fact that when they're 40, they're going to be good citizens. And from that flows all of the other needs that New Zealand's facing at the moment. From that flows academic success, the will to try, the will to attend school, because they've got that sense of character. Character as a word that has reduced in our language by 800% over the last 10 years. We don't say the word character anymore, and yet it's one of the critical needs for us as educators to think about as our responsibility in the years ahead. As we come through post-COVID, as we enter a different world, I think the key question for the New Zealand educators, educational people who make a difference, and Mr. Bolger asked me at lunchtime, if you had power, what would you do? And I said, I think I'd look at the good schools. What do we need to look at under the microscope are the good schools, the schools that are succeeding. Alwyn said it too. Why are those schools succeeding? If you look at the data in Alwyn's booklet, don't look at the Boys High one because he's completely wrong on that one, but the other ones, many of them are Catholic schools. Why are Catholic schools succeeding? Because the parents of those young men come with a will for those young men to succeed, and secondly, because they have a vision for character and a good man. And our vision at Hamilton Boys High School is to craft good men. And that has to come before anything else. And when we realise that, then I think all of the other things will definitely fall into place. I absolutely believe that. I believe it after 40 years of being involved. I think that there is a deficit model that's very dangerous. If we keep talking about the below-the-line realities, we lose track of the above-the-line solutions. And it's so important that students don't buy into the below-the-line deficit and start believing in it. I don't tell boys at Boys High that boys in New Zealand are underachieving by 12% when they're compared to girls, because that would just make them think there was no hope. It would make them think that it was okay to fail. Boys are wonderful at only doing the limit that they have to do to pass. So if they get a merit, they think that was a bit of waste of energy because they've done too much to just pass. And they're wonderful in that sense, but we have to be very, very aware of how much they are hopeful and they remain optimistic, and they are the people that are going to be leading this country in 2050. And we have to get it right. And that's my one point this afternoon, I think, to a group of people who can make a change and make a difference. This is our one chance post-COVID to get it right. We have to have the courage. The government has to have the courage to say, let's stop, reset, and relook at it. And the two people who are here with me this afternoon are both absolutely correct as well. But in the end, when people ask me, why is Hamilton Boys High School a successful school, why are your young men successful, I say it's because we love them so much, and they love us so much. It's a really, really simple formula. It's not what I came here to talk about this afternoon. It's not even in my notes. But it's all about the connection with our young people and working with them to make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to our speakers, and Alwyn may want to stick up for the men who who aim for more than a merit at some stage. As the only man sitting on the stage at the moment, you can mention.
Can I speak to that straight away?
You can briefly. Yep.
One of the most stunning moments in my whole teaching career as a practitioner for 32 years and a principal for 18 was sitting in a boys' school, not Hamilton Boys, but in a boys' school staff room when the academic results were being reviewed at the beginning of the year, and the head of science stood up and he said, well, you know, our academic results are ahead of the national average, and we're very proud of them, and the students have done well. And the head of maths stood up and said pretty much exactly the same thing, and the head of English stood up, and the head of English was a woman, and she said, well, our results are behind the national average, but you must remember we are teaching boys. I thought I was being punked. My jaw dropped open, and I thought if I was down the road at the matching girls' school and I said our science results are below national average, but you've got to remember we're teaching girls, I would have been lynched. And that attitude, it's not at Hamilton Boys, but it is pervasive throughout our society, that boys don't read as much, they don't like reading. You couldn't believe that Tolkien and Lewis wrote great novels, or all sorts of others. I think we need to have incredibly high aspirations for boys academically.
So what I'd like to do is ask some questions. We will take questions from the floor shortly, but we're just sorting out some mic issues, so I'm going to take a few questions from Slido, but please do sort out those questions that you'd like to store up and ask us. I'd like to ask a question about future focus. I think it's something that came through in each of your preliminary comments or your initial remarks. The question is, what does future focus really mean? And then how can we achieve this in a practical sense in education? Rachel, if you just hold it a little higher, the receiver's on the bottom of the mic, so if you hold it a bit higher. Yeah.
So look, I'll start with that, given it's my body of work over the last 25 years, thinking about the future. And actually it's interesting, because we do talk about education in this post-COVID world. I think we have to talk about just, this is the normal world. You know, for those who lived in Tamaki Makaurau or in Te Rāwhiti in Hawke's Bay right now, COVID is a long past, and they're thinking about the more emergent climate issues. Our students have dealt with more adversity in the last few years. Some of them haven't been to school for years and have missed the critical time in their schooling. I think we really have to understand that future fit means really being able to be highly adaptable to change. And the change is just starting. And for someone who trained as a technologist and then moved into education, the technology piece of it for me is still underpins all of my research. That we can't even imagine, if you take a business trip and you go into a comparative business of similar size offshore, you'll probably see automation and technology that you can't even imagine. And actually, if we want to be playing on the global stage, our students need to be thinking about technology in a completely different way, not as a kind of a core body of knowledge, but as a tool that is a necessity in any type of role. It doesn't matter if you're a personal trainer, a chef, or you're going into, you know, accountancy firm. Every one of those sectors now are all reliant on multiple different platforms, multiple different types of technologies. And one of the things that we see when we hire graduates from university, there's still a sort of an idea that technology sits as a side piece, that it's only for developers, it's only people who do comm science, when the reality is everything sits on platforms. Most businesses are now paperless and working digitally, remotely, with workforces that are distributed. And so we start to think about what that looks like going forward, and our students, how do they stay motivated if they're going into workforces where they're going to only be connecting potentially with clients, customers, colleagues in a digital world. And so we have to build those skills and capabilities so that they are core to their understanding. And there's still a big divide between what we're learning and teaching in the school environment, in the university environment. And it's really up to now the workforce. And of course it's a difficult when workforces are always hitting the ground running to take time out and bring people up to that skill set. So I would put a real play into, you know, constantly putting technology of our time at the forefront. You know, we're having all this debate. I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had with media in the last few weeks about ChatGPT. You know, everyone's suddenly jumping up and down. You know, if I talk to the average, I've got 4 children who've just gone through the school system and the university student system. They've been using AI for everything. You think of Grammarly, we've been using that for years. We use it across all of our production of anything from videos to audio to transcripts to language, dubbing, you know, creation of digital art. These things have been around for a long time. Whole sectors have been massively disrupted. And so we just need to make sure that we are thinking about the types of jobs that are coming up, because it's not going to be technology. It's not going to be technology in its own sake. Everything is technology enabled and adjacent. And so we have to understand that's part of the kind of the foundations of the new world.
Just very briefly, for the next 5 years, from a practical stance for schools, the curriculum refresh should be completely thrown out. It will be a huge distraction for schools. They'll concentrate on that rather than the children in front of them. The curriculum needs to be simplified. There is so much put into our curriculum by ideologues that is really not relevant to children. We want our children to grow up free, creative, informed thinkers, not people who are conforming to some nefarious group of adults' view of the world. I think that's incredibly important. And then the second thing, practically for schools, I think particularly unless we change very strongly what's happening in year 7, 8, 9 and 10 for literacy and numeracy, that the new credits for literacy and numeracy that you cannot get level 1 without will have a massive impact on lower socioeconomic Māori and Pasifika students. That's not to say that the credits aren't important, but it's to say we must change our teaching practice for those 4 years leading up to it to enable those kids to pass.
And that leads nicely on to my point, which is I think our focus has to be right in the centre, developing resilience in our young people, because they've lived in a world for the last 3 years where university entrance has been much easier to get, and I'm on the University Council here, and you see the results of that students are coming in with the easier UE, and they're finding it much more difficult to finish their first year at university. So we need to expect our students to be well educated by the time they leave. That we need to train them not to expect easy options. Schools need to stop offering soft UE subjects so that students can get UE in an easy way. Because I could get 100% of our students through UE if I offered soft subjects. And we remain committed to sustaining academic focus in our classrooms, and that needs to happen. We need to allow students to fail more, and we need to allow them to learn from that failure. And because otherwise, when they get into the real world, it's going to be a very, very frightening place for them. And students are very protected in our schools, I think, and we have protected them through COVID. It's been a very challenging time, but what we can learn from that is that students can cope. You know, they can cope with sometimes not having life easy, and they've been amazing through COVID. They've just managed very, very well. Our attendance statistics didn't change at all through COVID, really, apart from those who had COVID, and half of our school had COVID. But students just kept on wanting to do the best they could. But I think that we have, as a whole society in New Zealand, moved away from developing that sense of failure being a good thing and failure being a part of life, and that's what we need to focus on in the next 5 years, is have high expectations in our literacy and numeracy. The fact that over half of the students that did the literacy trial failed is something that is a testament to the fact that we need to expect more of our students right from year 7 onwards. And don't get us started on what the primary school's doing wrong, because, you know, we always blame the level below us. Universities blame the secondary schools too, so it's just exactly the same. So that is a really important part of it. Thank you.
And as Susan was talking there, I was thinking to a university course one of my own daughters thought about taking, which was called Learning to Fail. But she dropped the course because it turned out that the failure rate was really high in this paper, and part of the learning was to actually fail a lot of these students. So I was thinking about that. And we have to be very careful with the sort of incentives and arrangements that we set up. There were so many rich threads that came through that discussion, including on technology and AI, and of course in the university we're fascinated by this, and I can see questions coming through. There are questions on broader policy settings and so on. But I am going to invite, if there's anyone who's got questions from the room, okay, thanks.
Kia ora koutou, Naomi Pocock here again, sorry. I just wondered if you were talking about blaming the ones below you, but would you like to comment on the early years being the most formative towards the enthusiasm for curiosity and exploration and imagination, creativity, and the global trend towards drop and run daycare, if you wanted to comment on anything?
There's obviously in New Zealand, Nathan Wallace and Comet in Auckland and others have been doing some wonderful work about, they're calling it the first 1,000 days. I work a little bit with Nathan and with Comet, and I'm calling it Project 5.75, that we in New Zealand care for our, as I said before, our unborn in our first 5 years. And there are people like, I forget his first name, David Eagleman from Stanford University, probably the world's best communicative neuroscientist. Again, this is all well known, and we need to kind of get it out and pervasively into our community. But it moves on. I've been astounded at the current government's response to what is a crisis in attendance. And Susan's right, there are some schools where it hasn't dropped off at all. But to have a select committee where only 8 out of 2,500 schools submitted on the basis of no evidence at all, because they didn't go out into schools to find out why some schools children are attending, why some schools they aren't. They spent $84 million. They just spent another 74 on no further evidence, just to put 80 truancy officers out there. And on no single occasion have they mentioned teacher quality and school quality, and making it really necessary that schools are worthwhile coming to. The best the Education Review Office could do was say, make it a bit more fun. You know, kids can have fun at home, and that's what they're doing. And I was very interested talking to a Decile 10 student recently from a private school in central Auckland, and he said during COVID we worked out that we didn't need many of our teachers. We could do it ourselves, sitting around a coffee table, and all of this sort of stuff. And so it's not just in the lower decile schools. So schools, and I think, you know, many of the ideas up here already this afternoon, schools need to become worthwhile places by tapping into all of the good things that are now available and having incredibly high aspirations.
Francis, did you?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really interesting one, because when we think about in those early years, probably growing up, and maybe if you've got older children, there was a huge amount of active play. There's a real focus on activity, collaboration, creativity, and innovation. And there is a downside of technology as well that's come in, where it's very easy to give an iPad to a child and to find some other ways of entertaining. And so I think we've got studies that are coming through right now where there is a direct correlation between the overuse in the very early years of technology, and instead of keeping that focus on creativity. And I would really call out Finland as an example of one of the best education systems in the world. You don't start school till you're 7, you stay with the same teacher as a cohort, and actually the focus is really on outdoor play, indoor play, and then that collaborative piece. I think there's a lot to learn, but we also have a country where we've talked today about productivity, where people are dropping at daycare because they have no other option. It really is for many people, the only way you can get that support. And so it comes back to the first 1,000 days we know is critical that they learn, that idea with words and colours and form, and so much of that comes from home. And as we distribute our families across the world, that gets harder, so we have to really seek it out and understand that. And so I think part of it is we're in the early phase of not knowing enough about the effects. I think we'll know a lot more, and we'll probably look back at this time and wonder what we did for some of this overuse and overstimulation. But I think also we do need to kind of catch ourselves, all of us, with our view across education, because a lot of the things we hold on to, we forget the good things about the past, and we should bring some of those through, and we also forget to adopt the good things in the future. And so we need that right across all parts of the sector.
I think if you turn that question upside down, it's really important to retain that sense of awe and wonder that our young people have in those first 1,000 days right through to the end of year 13. And that's what it needs to be a goal, that our 18-year-olds have the same sense of awe and wonder that we should be cultivating in young people right from the start. And we did that, then I think we'd be quite a different society, quite a different world, and people would be so much happier, and that would bring all of the associated benefits with it.
And let's not stop at 18. Let's keep going. We have to have the these 18-year-olds when they move on to their next phase. If there's other questions in the room, please do raise your hand. Thanks.
Thank you. Jędrzej Białkowski, University of Canterbury. I first of all would like to thank panelists for a very stimulating discussion, but I would like to add and ask for a comments. I hear a lot about technology from the panelists, but during last 100, 200 years, each generation was living in a time of a new technology. Technology is no more than another tool. And I would like to heard from the panelists how the schools should address the problems which young people face on a social scene. How schools should build the attitudes. So let's not forget that attitude builds the altitude. And I have impression that, we all probably can agree here that schools should teach how to remain a learner for most of your life, but how the school should contribute to the build of attitudes, which seems to be missing in this discussion. Thank you.
I'm sure, Susan, yes, I predicted the microphone might go to you first.
Well, it is a very important question, I think, and everybody will agree with me. It's about educating people to use the tools that we have well, just as we've been doing since the Stone Ages, really. I mean, we just have different tools, and they're just as powerful. If we're talking about AI, I have a fellow headmaster in another boys' school who uses GPT to write his assembly talks now. Yeah, so he thinks it's wonderful. And we do have to use that as a tool. We need to develop an understanding of how we can use it as a tool. But it comes back to that sense of crafting good citizens. I mean, I will sound repetitive because I think it's an important point, that we need to craft citizens who understand how to use the tool of their age. You know, and we have to also understand C.S. Lewis's notion of chronological snobbery, that we all in our own age think that our way is the best way. But sometimes we have to go back and we have to look at the best of the past. And the best of the past was to create a young man who had that sense of arete, of being the best he could be in all aspects of his life. One of the aspects is technology, but there are all the other things that matter so much as well. So it's about crafting from the age of 2. I have a 2-year-old grandson, and he's only happy when he watches Bluey, which is a ghastly little cartoon program that the rest of us can't stand anymore because we see so much of it. What are we doing wrong? We know we're doing wrong, but it's no different from having one of those little things on a crib that went round and round 25, 30 years ago. We're still doing, it's all about stimulus, it's all about using the tools that we have in a positive way and in a measured way. Does that answer the question? I'll pass on to Alwyn so he can answer the question properly.
I've got another question for you, Alwyn, so if you don't want to answer this one, you can pass to Francis.
I still like SpongeBob, but one thing that we haven't mentioned here is activity and sporting activity, physical activity every day for children. I do quite a lot of work with great New Zealander Rod Dixon. It's 40 years since he won the New York Marathon, and he's got a kids marathon program that we put out into primary schools, getting kids out and active every single day, competitive, losing sometimes, winning sometimes. I thought the English cricket team, as you know, keeping in mind I made a lot of money off them, I think that their response to losing on Tuesday was incredible. And you know, that sort of character from physically competing is really important too.
Just back to the technology question in terms of evolution of technology, I think what we need to be really mindful of is how fast it's changing. And I know it's easy to say we've always had technological advancement and we've gone through different eras in the industrial age and moving into the digital age. I'll just use the example we've talked about with ChatGPT. To get to 100 million users of a telephone, an analog telephone that sat on our desk that we dialed, took 75 years. So from the time it was first invented, you had to get lines and the telephones and the technology and the telephonists and the exchanges. To get to 100 million users on ChatGPT took 24 days. And of those 100 million, 25 million of it use it daily. Now, so this is how fast it's changing. If we think about something like Pokemon Go, which was the very first mainstream AR tool that came out a few years ago, and you may have had family members chasing Pikachus around the neighbourhood, the same thing happened. It happened with an immediate adoption because they already had the phone or the iPad. The technology existed. It was an overlay. And I think this is where the distribution of technology is so fast. So just this week has come out that now we have 3.4 devices per person on the planet. So just a few years ago it was less than 1. And so the speed of which the internet is now overtaking what we can possibly do, the advances are going to be incredibly rapid. We cannot pretend that this stuff is not happening out there. The advances and the cognitive advances as we support ourselves with technology will change the future of our workplaces and our jobs and our careers. And if we start looking today, what I say with my graduate schools, we have professionals who study with us. We say, look at your job and now go to the Silicon Valley website and find the same title and see if you could look at the job description and if you could do that job. And everyone gets horrified because they realise what they're asking for the same role in a more advanced economy is fundamentally different. We have to look at other countries. We have to understand the speed of which this is going to change the way we operate as a country if we're going to stay globally competitive.
Thanks, Francis. I'm going to ask a question from Slido, but do keep waving out if you've got questions from the floor. Alwyn, I'll start with you on this one and the others may like to add to it. How can we best serve the needs of a wide range of children, including gifted and neurodiverse children? I think this is something you had an interest in.
Well, my master's degree was in teaching gifted and talented children, and I've thrown most of that theory out. for a whole range of very good reasons. But the main one being that, first of all, two main ones. First of all, if you label 5% of your population or school population as being gifted, you're labelling 95% as being non-gifted. And I don't think that's acceptable. And then the second part of it is that there is no longer a strongly held view that human ability is a fixed construct. In fact, when children come into the two schools at South and West Auckland that are helped establish, and we did EASTL tests, and we would find on average they were 2 years behind, I would insist to my staff members that they regard that period of time that they need to catch up, that they would regard that they're behind because of environmental reasons, not because of internal ability reasons. The second thing, I mean, neurodiverse learners, I just love those anecdotes. I mean, I remember having another meeting and we were at that stage building character, and so we were talking to the students about what they do for their parents. And I said to them in the meeting this morning, Monday morning, anyone put your hand up, what did you do for your parents on the weekend that was just fantastic? And an 11-year-old girl put her hand up, Millie, and she said, I let my mum go out cougaring on Saturday night. And we all just looked, and I said, okay, end of the meeting, off to class. But one of the neat things in that school environment was it wasn't one rule for all. Each person was seen individually. And sometimes in a classroom, there needs to be a different rule for a child who sees the world in a different way. And one of the great disappointments from a straight professional perspective, over 3 years, we asked the Labour government to allow us to establish a 480 student school near a transport hub in central Auckland for neurodiverse learners as a designated character school. And the Ministry of Education say no, and then try and work out the reasons why. And it's simply not acceptable, and those children need that kind of service.
Susan, if I can turn to Susan for a question, please. What's the role of vocational success alongside academic success?
Vocational, well, they're equally important. There are so many types of success which are important. I'm not sure what the question really means, other than for me to say that it's so obvious that they are. There used to be a system, you know, those of us who've been around a long time remember the vocational schools, vocational pathways schools, and now schools are expected to be all things to all people, and so it is a very real challenge for us. We have students at Hamilton Boys High School doing level 3 music up here at university, and we have students who are really working very, very hard over 4 years to get level 1 through a vocational pathway. So it's the diversity of our learners that really is a key part of what we have to do when we're setting our goals, establishing our goals. Vocational pathways are a key aspect of ensuring that all students can have success, because that is their area of strength. First 15 rugby is an area which is a vocational pathway now. So the whole notion of vocational pathways has changed over the years, because people can make their careers in such a wide spectrum of ways, from a young man who's finishing his level 3 music at university because he did his letters when he was in year 9, to a young man who's going to work very, very hard to have the skills to be able to work on the roads when he leaves school when he's 17. The other thing about secondary schools is that they used to be like a triangle when I was at school. Year 13 was a small group, and now they're a rectangle. Students are staying at school longer. The needs of our students are changing, and I come back to my point at the very beginning that crafting good citizens is what it's all about, and ensuring that they can have a meaningful pathway all the way through. There are some wonderful programs run by the ministry, Gateway, trades academies. They're too small, they're underfunded, everything is underfunded. And that's the tragedy for these young women and young men. We've got 80 people on a Gateway program. We could have 150. We have a roll of 2,300, and it could easily be 150 to 200 young men in those programs. But we get what we're funded to get, and that's the end. And that's the end. We use some of our international student funding to ensure that more young men who need vocational pathways get them. COVID has shown so dramatically that schools cannot exist without international students, and that's another aspect of the underfunding, which is really quite frightening for us, and we're looking in those futures, because the needs, as Alwyn says, it's not just your neurodiverse, it's just the broad range of young people's needs that we do need to meet in the future. And when I talk about stepping back and resetting what education is all about, then those are the things we need to consider of what's the best way in which we, as a very small country, can work it out so that we're doing the very best we can for all of those diversities. Thank you.
We're almost out of time, but I'm going to ask one very brief question that you're allowed 10 seconds to respond to. If money were no problem, what would you do different? Susan, do you want to start with that one? Just a brief, if money were no problem. You just talked about money in your last...
Yeah, if money was no problem, I'd probably sack half of the people in ministry and divert that so there was even more money in schools. If money was no problem, I think we would need to really, really look at the good schools. We would have the courage to get rid of some of the schools that are really struggling. We would educate school principals in genuine leadership, and we would pay teachers what they deserve to be paid so that we would get a stronger teaching workforce. And if we had a stronger teaching workforce, we'd have a stronger economy. And it's as simple as that in the end. Teachers work very, very hard, whatever you may think about us, that we get 14 weeks holiday a year, that we go home at 3:15. It is genuinely not true. Teachers work very, very hard, and they deserve to be paid a living wage. And that's the trouble when you've got first-year teachers still earning $56,000 and they've taken 4 or 5 years to get their degree. It's not good enough.
Thanks, Susan. And Alwyn, you can see Susan's got a bit of a shopping list there, including some things she'd get rid of. But a brief, what would you do? Money's no object. 10 seconds, because we're over time.
I'm prepared to become the Secretary for Education. I'm a man of simple tastes, so I'll save the education system $284,000 by doing it at half the price of the current employee, and that's a start.
And I would make sure that all policymakers are really well informed about the big shifts that are happening in the world, starting with the demographics here and what the impact will be into the future.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had wonderful presentations from Francis, from Alwyn and from Susan, hugely rich insights during the discussion that followed. So thanks very much to our panellists for wonderful presentations and panel.